Imagine this. You're driving to work, thinking about coffee and deadlines, and an hour later you're in handcuffs for a crime you didn't commit. The judge looks at you like you've already confessed, and the only thing keeping you afloat is a lawyer who turns the courtroom into a battlefield. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. Let's start from the beginning. Jerome Williams, 29, had always been the poster child for playing by the rules. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in Chicago, he grew up with two strict but loving parents who drilled into him the importance of integrity and hard work. For Jerome, following the law wasn't just a principle, it was second nature. He had a stable job as a software engineer, a clean record, and a reputation as the fixer among his friends. So the last place he ever expected to find himself was in the back of a police cruiser, accused of a crime he didn't commit. It all started one Tuesday morning. Jerome was cruising through the city in his friend Mal's car, a sleek black sedan. Malcolm had lent it to him for the week while his own car was in the shop. Jerome had no idea that borrowing a friend's car would land him in the middle of a nightmare. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Okay, no big deal, he thought, pulling over. His heart pounded, but he told himself it was just a routine check. The officer approached, tapping on the window with that smug authority that immediately put Jerome on edge. License and registration, the officer demanded, barely glancing at Jerome as he handed over the documents. Sure, officer, Jerome replied, keeping his tone calm. Is there a problem? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he returned to his cruiser, leaving Jerome sitting there stewing in confusion. Minutes later, the cop came back with backup, 2 more officers, and things went south fast. Step out of the vehicle. Sir, the officer barked. What's going on? Jerome asked, now genuinely alarmed. This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle, the cop said, his tone cold and final, as if Jerome's guilt was already decided. Jerome blinked in disbelief. Stolen? That's impossible. This is my friend's car. I have his permission. Save it, the cop interrupted, grabbing Jerome's arm and slapping handcuffs on him. The humiliation was instant and sharp, like a punch to the gut. People on the sidewalk slowed down to gawk, their stares cutting into Jerome like daggers. Weeks later, Jerome stood in a courtroom that felt more like an arena. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He wore his best suit, a charcoal gray number that his mom had bought him years ago, and tried to appear confident, though his stomach churned with anxiety. The judge, Simon Drake, was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Drake had a reputation for being tough on defendants, and it didn't take long for Jerome to realize he was about to become just another statistic in this man's courtroom. Well, Mr. Williams, Judge Drake began, peering over his glasses. His voice dripped with condescension. First time in my court? I hope you're enjoying the experience. The courtroom chuckled, and Jerome felt his cheeks flush with anger. But he bit his tongue. He knew better than to lose his cool here. Drake wasn't done. He picked up a folder and waved it theatrically. So, you're telling me you had no idea this car was stolen? How charming. Maybe your lawyer will juggle for us next. The crowd laughed again, and Jerome's fists clenched at his sides. His lawyer wasn't even in the room, delayed by another case, and here he was, alone, the butt of everyone's joke. Jerome's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had the system, which he'd always believed in, turned against him so ruthlessly? The next day, the courtroom was buzzing like a hive of nervous bees. Jerome sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, trying not to show how close he was to losing it. He had no idea who his replacement lawyer would be, and honestly, his faith in the system was already hanging by a thread. Then the door opened, and the energy in the room shifted, like a cold wind blowing through a summer day. In walked Amanda Carter, and let me tell you, she owned the room from the second her heels clicked against the marble floor. She was 33, sharp as a tack, and dressed to kill in a navy blue power suit that screamed, "Mess with me and you'll regret it." Her gaze swept across the courtroom like a spotlight, and for a moment it felt like even Judge Drake forgot how to breathe. Jerome couldn't help but stare. Who was this woman? And more importantly, how had she ended up in his corner? He didn't have time to wonder because Amanda was already moving, like she'd been planning this showdown for weeks. She dropped her leather briefcase onto the defense table with a satisfying thud, pulled out a folder thicker than a phone book, and gave Jerome a quick nod. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I've got this." Amanda turned to face Judge Drake, her expression cool and unflinching. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "We're going to need to address some glaring issues with this case, starting with the fact that the charges against my client are based on a tissue of lies." The courtroom gasped. Drake leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching into a smirk. "Miss Carter, I suggest you tread carefully. I run my courtroom based on facts, not emotions." Amanda didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her arms, tilting her head slightly like a teacher who just caught a student cheating. "Facts? That's interesting, because the so-called facts here don't hold up under even the slightest scrutiny. Or is this court now operating on assumptions and convenience?" Drake's smirk faltered. "Miss Carter, I don't appreciate your tone, and I don't appreciate the blatant disregard for due process." Amanda shot back, her voice rising just enough to make everyone sit up straighter. "You've already decided my client is guilty, haven't you? You're playing detective, prosecutor, and jury all at once. Unless, of course, that's a new policy you've implemented without notifying the bar." The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Drake's face turned an alarming shade of red. But Amanda wasn't done. She picked up her folder and began flipping through pages with the precision of a surgeon. "Let's start with the arrest," she said, pacing slowly. "The police claimed the vehicle was reported stolen. Yet the owner, my client's friend, never filed such a report. Funny, isn't it? Almost as if someone jumped to conclusions." She turned to the audience, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And then we have the interrogation. Hours of questioning without a lawyer present. My client was treated like a suspect before anyone bothered to gather evidence." Drake tried to interject, but Amanda silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not finished. Your Honor, let's talk about the footage from the arrest." She held up a stack of papers. The dash cam conveniently malfunctioned, and yet multiple witnesses recorded the incident on their phones. Funny how technology seems to fail at the most opportune moments. Jerome couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: relief. Amanda was tearing the prosecution's case apart, piece by piece, and she made it look easy. By the time Amanda finished her argument, Judge Drake looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. He tried to regain control, banging his gavel with a little too much force. "Miss Carter, this courtroom has rules. You do well to remember them." Amanda didn't even blink. "And you do well to remember the Constitution. Your Honor, I'm here to ensure my client gets a fair trial, even if I have to remind you what that looks like." The room erupted in murmurs. Even Jerome couldn't hide his grin. Amanda Carter wasn't just defending him. She was fighting for him like his life depended on it. And maybe it did. For the first time, the balance of power in that courtroom began to shift. Jerome wasn't just another defendant anymore. With Amanda by his side, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The third day of the trial began with Judge Simon Drake walking into the courtroom with the confidence of someone determined to regain control. His gavel hit the desk with a loud crack, demanding silence before he even sat down. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone in the room could sense that Drake was gearing up for a showdown. Amanda Carter, as poised as ever, didn't flinch. She sat at the defense table, reviewing her notes like she had all the time in the world. Jerome glanced at her, trying to draw some of her calmness into his own rattled nerves. She noticed his look and gave him the slightest nod, as if to say, "Don't worry, we've got this." Judge Drake wasted no time throwing his weight around. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone dripping with faux professionalism, "your behavior in this courtroom has been colorful. Let me remind you that sanctions are well within my authority if this continues." Amanda stood, her heels clicking confidently as she approached the bench. "Colorful, Your Honor? If by colorful you mean ensuring justice is served, then I'll take that as a compliment. A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience. Drake's eyes narrowed. Miss Carter, you are dangerously close to crossing the line. Amanda didn't miss a beat. With all due respect, Your Honor, the only line I'm concerned about is the one between justice and prejudice. And right now, it's looking pretty blurry. Before Drake could respond, Amanda turned to the prosecution. Let's get to the facts, shall we? I'd like to call Detective Harris to the stand. Detective Harris, the officer responsible for Jerome's arrest, took the stand with a confidence that quickly began to